Okay, so I'd like to welcome everybody to this week's webinar. We will be discussing dry hopping and the effects of time and temperature on dry hopping with Dr. Christina Schönberger and Corbinian Hasselbeck from the Barth Haas Hops Academy. For those of you who've signed in before, who've done these webinars before, you'll notice you can't talk during the webinar. But if you have any questions, please put them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. During the webinar, Christina will be presenting, so Christina will be on screen during the webinar, but Corbinian will be able to handle some of your Q&A. So some of them we'll keep to the end if we think it's something that's very good for everybody to hear about. We'll talk about, we'll answer your questions later. Some of them Corbinian can answer on the spot. So if you have a particular question about a slide, Corbinian can help you with that. So he'll be off screen answering Q&A questions as well. So yeah, the webinar is going to last, I guess, 35-40 minutes from Christina, and then after that we'll have a Q&A. So we've got lots of questions lined up to do with dry hopping, because obviously dry hopping is a very important topic in brewing at the moment. Yeah, without further ado, let me introduce you to Christina, who will be presenting today. So Christina's been with Barth Haas for 15 years, and she's a graduate of the Weihenstephan Brewing University, and she did a PhD in non-volatile taste components in lager beers. So uniquely positioned, I guess, to talk to us about hops today. Together with George Drexler, who some of you may remember from past Sea Brews. She runs the Brewing Solutions team at Barth Haas, which is a group of 10 brewing engineers, and they do technical support and product development and programs for the Hops Academy. So they support their sales teams as well with technical support. So today she is going to present to us on dry hopping, the right timing. So I'm now going to pass you over to Christina, put you in her capable hands for the next 35 to 40 minutes for her presentation. So Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Charles, for the introduction, and also thanks for inviting us here today to talk about dry hopping. We are really happy to talk with you today about the right timing of dry hopping. I will start sharing my screen now. Okay, that hopefully works for everybody, that you can see. Dry hopping, the right timing. There are many things that are important for dry hopping, and we will talk briefly about the main factors that are important for dry hopping. But here you already see some pictures of our team. It's not all 10 of us. These are my colleagues that are primarily involved in our seminars. And then, of course, there's George and more brewing engineers that help us to put together all the information we can find. So when we talk about dry hopping, how do I change the slide? Here. Dry hopping, especially the last couple of years, it's a big topic for brewers, because a lot of the craft beers that are now successful and on the market and actually not relevant to a certain beer style, dry hopping can be really done at every beer style. And the main factors in dry hopping are the timing. When are you doing the dry hopping during your process on the cold side? Which materials can you use in terms of hop products? This can be cones, it can be pellets, it can be extracts, it can be oils. And then how do you do it? Which method are you using? Do you use a traditional method, a static method? Do you use a solution of the last couple of years from the engineering companies that helps you with dynamic methods? And then the big question mark, how can we explain the flavor that results from dry hopping? That's a very complex topic. And then, of course, the magic combination of hops and yeast interaction that we will also discuss a little today, but that also merits an extra chapter. How do the aroma components that are produced by yeast and hops interact, and how does yeast biotransform hop components into very beautiful flavors. But let's jump into the topic of timing. The power of dry hopping, really generally, dry hopping adds a lot of value to your product. It has a big impact on your flavor. It determines a big part of the character of the beer, because the dry hopping always goes along with a very pretty intensive hop aroma. You can use it to describe your style. You can use it in marketing. A couple of years ago, a couple of big brewers used the topic dry hopping also for their marketing, TV commercials, for example. In terms of brewing technologies, depending on how you do the dry hopping, it can help you with flavor stability. Although the term stability is a bit misleading, because the dry hopping aroma is not stable, but it can help you to mask other flavors that might otherwise occur in your beer. It definitely changes your drinkability. We did a couple of trials where we found that in most cases, dry hopping aroma increases drinkability. And then the polyphenols, that's also a big topic for brewers. They are relevant, and you bring in a big portion of polyphenols with dry hopping. And these polyphenols, they have impact on your colloidal stability. They can have impact on your perceived bitterness. They can have impact on your mouthfeel. But the group of polyphenols is a very large group, so it's not yet really known what the detailed action of polyphenols in dry hopped beers are. Decision steps. There are a couple of questions that you as a brewer have to ask yourself when you start with dry hopping. So first you have to define the product profile. If you want to develop a new product, which beer style are you looking at? Or you start from the hops. You say, I want definitely brew with these hop varieties. How can I build a beer matrix around these hop varieties so that the aroma of these varieties is transported in a very good manner? And then you have the selection of a lot of hop products. Depending on your philosophy, depending on your brewery, you can choose extracts. A lot of products are available. This is actually not a question. And then the technology. Do you have an extra vessel for dry hopping? Do you have to fit it in your current process? And this makes dry hopping very individual. There's not an easy flyer that we can put together. This is the best way to do dry hopping, because every brewery is very unique and has to find its own solution how it can carry out the dry hopping process. The dry hopping time, here's a picture of the brewery. And dry hopping, when we say dry hopping, we mean the addition of hops in the cold block, and that can be during fermentation, that can be during maturation, during lagering, or even during filtration if you work with products like Aroma products. We will focus on 3 areas: main fermentation, maturation, and lagering. There's a little of, I think, some differences in what is understood with main fermentation, maturation. Lagering, I think, is pretty clear. Here we tried with our symbols, we tried to make an emphasis that during main fermentation you have the highest activity in terms of fermentation. This is also what the little arrows want to express. You have a lot of active yeast that is producing CO2 and aroma components, also a loss of aroma components. During maturation, the activity of the fermentation is already decreasing or is decreased. And then in lagering, it's basically not almost no activity going on. And these are the three different times that you can choose for dry hopping. And you can also do, and a couple of brewers are doing this, they use a couple of steps on the cold side for dry hopping. So that can be double dry hopping or 3 times dry hopping in any of these times. Talking about main fermentation. In the stage of main fermentation, we find a couple of conditions that influence the dry hopping outcome or the result. Here's a picture from our brewery. This is the hand of one of our brewers and the hand of the other brewer. We have 2 engineers running our brewery. In terms of fermentation, main fermentation, it's of course important how the temperature profile is going on compared to maturation or lageration. You have a low ethanol content in the beginning. That's important in terms also for microbiological safety. And you have a lot of active yeast. If the yeast that you're using is happy and doing a good job, the yeast will consume a lot of oxygen, and a lot of flavor transformation can take place here at the main fermentation, also a lot of ester production. But with this activity and going on during main fermentation, you also have a lot of absorption of flavor components on the yeast material, and you will lose a lot of flavors through the fermentation. And then either you have open fermentation, you still find that in many breweries. That has, of course, an impact also on the flavor. So these are the different things that you have to consider during main fermentation. And we have a little video that shows, that is from our brewery, that shows you the fermentation with the development of the foam and the hop material. And I think it's a nice way to see how much life we have in the brewery. Here comes the hops. And here was the yeast and hops explosion. Okay. Oops. So, as you saw in the video also, this was not ideal, of course, that the beer during fermentation goes over the edge of the fermentation vessel. And with this, we have the challenge of the loss of flavor components. Corbinian, who's here with me today, he just finished his PhD, and his topic was on looking into different yeast strains and their fermentation properties in combination with hops. And here are some numbers that you can see. On the right-hand side, you see the linalool and the myrcene content, depending on the amount of yeast cells in million per milliliter. And what you see here is, because we have a huge surface, it depends on the properties of the aroma component. If it stays in the beer like linalool, linalool is an alcohol that is very soluble in liquids, and compared to myrcene, which is a very volatile flavor component, you see that you lose a lot of myrcene due to the activity of yeast and the evaporation and the absorption of these components on the surface. And since we have, or we know that we have about 800 aroma components, and each component has a little bit different properties in terms of hydrophobic or hydrophilic behavior. It's basically a very differentiated picture for all aroma components, how they behave during fermentation. Therefore, I filled in here a table that shows you what we think is important in terms of flavor components, and it's categorized by the sensory categories that we use when we describe hop aroma. And you find a mixture of a lot of different components. We have alcohols, we have esters, we have ketones, we have thiols, sulfur-containing components, we have monoterpenes, we have oxidized terpenes, we have sesquiterpenes. And I marked the components that contain sulfur because when we talk about thresholds of these components, we have a huge difference in terms of importance. All the flavor components that contain sulfur, they have a threshold that is either 1,000 times or 10,000 times lower than all the other components. So in terms of flavor activity, these are the most flavor active components, and they can be really nice, like the 4-MMP, the 3-4-MP, they give you all the grapefruit, citrus type flavors, and we also have thiols that are related to a lot of sweet fruit flavors. Rhubarb, we have pineapple, we have mango, we have passion fruit. These are all connected to these sulfur components. And so most active are these sulfur components, but they can also be nasty, they can sting, they can give vegetal notes. And then we have a lot of alcohols and esters. They are roughly in the same range in terms of thresholds, like geraniol, citronellol, alpha-terpenol. They give you floral and citrus flavors. And then for the spicy and herbal flavors, it's probably related to a lot of sesquiterpenes or oxidized sesquiterpenes. And for those, it's not clear how the thresholds are, but what is published in the literature, these thresholds are much higher than those of the floral, citrus, or fruit-related components. So for main fermentation, there are a couple of reasons that are in favor of doing the dry hopping during main fermentation. The temperature, you have an increase in extraction, the activity of the yeast, you have a lot of oxygen scavenging. You have a natural agitation, so you have a good mixture during of the beer during fermentation. You have a lot of flavor potential, but you also have a couple of things that you have to consider. Often you cannot, or actually always, you cannot use the yeast again because of the amount of hops you're using. You have a big portion of evaporation through CO2 stripping, so you have some amount of flavor losses. You have the flotation of hop particles, and you have the foaming, or a lot of foam development. And then you have to consider the hop creep. I assume that everybody is familiar with the hop creep, which refers to the fact that hops contains enzymes that continue to ferment when together with yeast in beer, and that has an influence on the CO2 content, on the alcohol content that you can reach, and has to be considered and understood. And you have a low ethanol in the beginning during main fermentation. So this can bring a microbiological risk, though in our technical support work, we do not have any cases where brewers have complained that they had issues with that, and you have a lower extraction. So next topic is dry hopping during maturation. So the yeast is already harvested. In the stage of maturation, you will find the following conditions that will be influenced by dry hopping, or that will influence the dry hopping. You have higher temperatures compared to lagering. You have basically the final ethanol content. You have a low amount of active yeast, so this means you have a minor oxygen consumption, also not so much going on in terms of biotransformation. You have less agitation, especially with the jacket cooling, and you also have a minor gas release or evaporation or closed vessel for carbonating. And this is Lawrence, who's in our brewery working. So in terms of maturation, what is in favor of using maturation as a stage for dry hopping? You have a good temperature and ethanol profile for an increased extraction. You have still oxygen scavenging, however, this is reduced. You have agitation with jacket cooling, and you have an improved flavor yield in terms of maybe a little bit more of control what is going on in your flavor. Not in favor for using maturation for dry hopping. You still have its on the yeast due to the high surface, and you have some evaporation, and there's still some potential for foaming, or foaming that shouldn't is not in your favor, and also hop creep. Lagering is probably the time point that is mostly used, definitely in Germany. I think also going back in the history, I think the stage of lagering is the traditional time point for dry hopping. And in the stage of lagering, we find the following conditions that can influence the dry hopping. We have a closed system, and we have low temperatures. We have the final ethanol content, so, and this can be very different depending on which beer style you're working with, so this has a big impact. There's no yeast present, so you have no interaction, and that makes it easier to have more control of the flavor that is developing, and you have no agitation. So positive for doing dry hopping during lagering. The ethanol is an important factor for the extraction that takes place when you do dry hopping. And here you have already the final content. You have the lowest losses for flavor components because it's a closed system. You don't have, you have a minimal amount of yeast, you have a minimal amount of enzyme activity, and you do not have any foam development. But also the low temperatures are, of course, decreasing your extraction. The temperature profile is also important for which flavor components are extracted. We can talk about this a little later in detail. You have no agitation. You have a delayed extraction of flavor components. So with low temperatures, of course, it needs a longer time to get the flavor components extracted. For example, 2 degrees centigrade versus 20 degrees centigrade is a totally different picture in terms of flavor extraction. but you don't have any scavenging effects. And also the hop creep shouldn't be an issue here in the lagering time point. So during main fermentation, this is already summing up a little bit my presentation. During main fermentation, we have a high extraction. We have an excellent mixing. We have oxygen scavenging, which is really important for flavor stability later on. But it's challenging in terms of working conditions, and it needs a really good yeast management. In lagering or during lagering, we have a good extraction and minor losses, but we don't have any biotransformation in terms of flavor development going on. It's also challenging in terms of working conditions, and it's requiring a high level of experience. During maturation, it's a bit of both worlds. As you can see, high extraction, good mixing, you have reduced losses, you still have oxygen scavenging going on. So in summary, you just have to make your decision where you want to do it, and also if you want to combine these steps, this is all possible. This is a graph that shows you, and this is not robust science data, but reflects what we have experienced in our trial, in our pilot breweries in Germany and also in the US, and shows that this is an example where we produce beers with citra in terms of hop pellets, or in form of hop pellets. And we added these pellets at the beginning of fermentation, then after 72 hours into fermentation, or basically at the very end of fermentation. And it shows a little bit how the flavor development can be seen if you compare these three timing points. So the berry intensity, this would mean flavors like black currant and also strawberry, blackberry, blueberry. They are more intensive with a later addition of hop pellets. The sweet fruit intensity, so that's in our scheme, all what is tropical, sweet fruits, mango, passion fruit, pineapple, has a bit of an increase if you go later, or if you do the addition later during fermentation, and then also it has some decrease in the course of fermentation. The herbal and spicy intensity and also the vegetal intensity, that is the same line as the orange line, continues from the beginning of fermentation to the end of fermentation. As I said, this is not the robust scientific data, but this is reflecting our experience so far. But I'm very experiences are in these flavor categories. So there are things you can do if you are looking to extract specific flavors, if those should be citrus flavors, if those should be floral flavors, or green flavors, spicy flavors, or herbal flavors. This is depending on the timing, and it's depending on the temperature. It's also depending on all the other factors that we have to consider during dry hopping. But especially for the fruity flavors, the yeast plays an important role, and the duration also plays an important role. We've seen in some small scale trials that we did that if you are working with higher temperatures in dry hopping, that you have the development of more oxidized sesquiterpenes that are related to spicy and herbal components. So this would mean that if you're working with colder temperatures, it's probably more beneficial for floral and fruity flavors. And if you are working at higher temperatures, the danger of if you not want to have a lot of intensive spicy and herbal flavors, it's more given working with higher temperature during dry hopping. This is just an example to show you if you are working with certain hop varieties and you want to check out their profile in terms of flavors. You can do this on our website. This is an example for mosaics so that you already have an idea of the hop variety, how it's being described with the 12 flavor categories, and then we are happy to help you to define what varieties are suitable if you're looking for certain flavors in a dry hop beer. While we talk about timing, I thought it would also be a good opportunity to show you this slide. It's not only the timing in the brewery, it's also the timing of the harvest that has a big impact on the flavor profile. And this is an example of the variety Mandarina Bavaria. And we are doing some research in this field. And here you can see we have the 12 flavor categories from floral on the fruity side, and here the herbal spicy side. And the normal time for harvesting Mandarina is end of September. And this is here the gray area where you see a high citrus intense flavor. And we tried, or we harvested Mandarina at different time points from early in September until pretty late in October. And you can see with the late harvesting of Mandarina Bavaria, we have a decrease of all the fruity flavors and an increase of the vegetal and spicy flavors. And we see this in other varieties, but it's very variety specific. And it's very important that you find the right timing for each variety in order to harvest also the flavors that you are looking for. And these are some dates if you are interested in talking more about dry hopping. We have a series through May, June, and July that goes into the different chapters. We are also happy if we can come back here with more details, talking about maybe different hop products or the different methods that you can use for dry hopping. And with this, I'm actually at the end of my presentation, and I hand back over to Charles. And I stop sharing my presentation.
Okay. Okay, Christina, I'll just need to bring my camera back on. Yeah. Hi, Christina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. Thanks for the presentation. I think we've got I think the questions are going to be getting more into the nitty gritty and challenging you. Because I guess it's quite difficult to put a presentation together not knowing the different levels of brewers that you're dealing with, that you're presenting to. So we've got a load of questions lined up. Those of you who do have questions for the Q&A, please put them through the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll throw them at Christina, and we'll see what Christina and Corbinian can help you guys out with. So we'll start with some of the questions that have been already sent in to us. Mm-hmm. So I guess Christina will get you going on this one first. And just quickly, let's say sorry about the sound quality during the presentation. It was a little bit scratchy, okay. But thank you to everyone for persevering and keeping going. So the first question we have: sometimes when there is a huge hop bill added during the dry hopping stage to attain certain profiles to the beer, there can be too much of astringency or grassiness in the final product. Assuming we don't have the newest technology and we still need to do physical add pelletized hops during fermentation, what are the best ways to avoid all these undesired flavors and mouthfeel?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it relates to the amount of hops that you are using for dry hopping. I know that some brewers are using really massive amounts of hops, and with that, I think that sometimes less is actually more in terms of obtaining the fruity and floral and citrus flavors. I think this is also related. I think there's a study of Tom Schallhammer saying that if you go beyond 800 grams per hectoliter, you are basically overfloating your sensory system. So more is not always more. In terms of astringency, if brewers are working with 1 kilograms or more per hectoliter, you have a lot of polyphenols that you put into the process. And I think that has definitely a role in the perceived astringency. And then, of course, it's, as we discussed, the temperature profiles during dry hopping. It's also the method that you are using. We know that from dynamic dry hopping, where you obtain a very high extraction within a couple of hours, that if you are doing this too long for too many days or hours, that astringency can pick up. So okay. This is that's what I would.
So it's basically
Corbinian, do you have
quantity and timing.
Yeah.
Corbinian, anything?
Maybe we could add that the separation of the small hop particles is very important. So when we are talking about hop burn, for example, it could also be an issue when we're talking about polyphenols and hop particles. So along in cold storage would be important that we have a good separation of the whole amount of vegetative material of the hops. So okay. Also an aspect.
Okay, right. Okay, so during your presentation, you mentioned the different stages you could put the hops, you could add the hops for your dry hopping. And you mentioned the main fermentation, maturation, and lagering stages. So we have a question about first wort hopping. And it's, does first wort hopping contribute significantly to bitterness units in your beer? Because it appears to be some brewers who feel that, or the brewers that feel that you get a more rounded bitterness when you do first wort hopping. Would that be correct?
That's a good question. We didn't do any trials where we, in our pilot plants, did first wort hopping. So with a first wort hopping, you would mean that the addition is basically before the lagering.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it can be true that it's beneficial for bitterness because the beer goes through the whole process, and you will probably have a loss of a little bit of utilization with that during the process. I know that there were studies more looking into if first wort hopping has benefits on flavor stability. But I don't think there was a clear conclusion to that. In terms of bitterness, we don't have experience with first wort hopping.
Are you familiar with any studies that have been done, or is it very much at the early stages where it's more down to taste panels, the tasting panels have assessed the beers?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any studies that specifically looked into first wort hopping in terms of quality of bitterness for the beers.
Corbinian, are you familiar at all with any work on that?
No, sorry.
No. Okay, no problem. Okay, so we've got a question that's come up on the screen. Can you give us a few words on using a hop gun? It says high agitation, short time. Are there more particles to settle? You know, is this something that you recommend, or something you need to be careful of when you're using?
Yeah, I think the hop gun is definitely the most popular system for dry hopping. We, in our pilot brewery, we have from Kaspar Schulz the Hop Rocket, which is a little different. But what we have heard from brewers using a hop gun, they are all very positive in general. It takes time to, if you are changing from a traditional system to the hop gun, it takes time to adjust the amount of hops and to adjust the times for circulating and everything to obtain the same flavor that you had before. But once these trials are settled, I think the brewers, most of the brewers are really happy with the hop gun in terms of fast flavor extraction and fast dry hopping.
Is there anything you need to be wary of, Corbinian, when you're using the hop gun?
I think if you use it right way, so not overdose it, the hop particles are retained very good. And that's a big positive aspect of the hop gun, that you have a retention of the hop particles. And so the following steps are not that complicated to separate the hops from the beer.
Okay. Next up, please can you tell us some key hygiene factors and SOPs for avoiding infections during dry hopping?
Yeah. Generally, I would say that we don't have any cases where the breweries would come to us and say that they have a microbiological problem with dry hopping. I think the normal brewing process is already so highly developed and highly hygienic that dry hopping doesn't present a high microbiological risk. In terms of SOPs, I don't know, Corbinian, I don't know if you have some input on that.
The general rules, like when you're working with yeast, clean and disinfected surfaces, and so general.
Yeah, just general cleanliness, keep everything
hygiene,
clean, keep it.
Working standards,
Yeah, good hygiene. Always good for the brewery.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Okay, how does the pH of beer affect the hydrolysis of glycoside? Are there any suggestions on ideal time periods to dry hop during the active fermentation?
I mean, this question already implicates that, or this is about aroma, I guess, the hydrolysis of aroma components.
I believe so. Yeah.
Implicates that this is that this hydrolysis in terms of achieving more aroma components adds to the flavor. But when we reviewed all the literature there is in terms of hydrolysis of aroma components, there's some work from Tom Schellhammer again and also Patrick Ting, where you try to obtain more linalool or other components from hydrolysis. It doesn't really, in my opinion, it's not a big contribution to the overall flavor. I would not invest a lot of energy to support hydrolysis in the brewing process.
And regarding the pH, so what we saw in our research project at the Technical University of Munich, so that during main fermentation or maturation, the same activity, an enzyme activity by the yeast beta glycosidase, and we confirmed results by Takoy et al., for example. So just looking at the enzyme activities, there's no big difference at different stages. But as Christina said, the contribution to the flavor, I think it's not that high, so should not be overrated.
Not a huge impact.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any research or experiments confirming that double dry hopping with multiple hop batches over 2 days really does create a more aromatic beer, or is this just an industry byword?
I think this goes back to what we have already briefly touched, that there is a saturation curve in terms of flavor extraction possibility. So depending on what that would mean, if you work with maybe 200 grams here and 200 grams there, you achieve a more intense flavor, but it's not a linear increase. So the more you double or increase the hop amount, the lower is the utilization in terms of aroma intensity. So I think this is a question to the brewer. If he has a certain flavor profile he wants to obtain and he takes into account a bad utilization of hops, because he has to use this amount of hops to achieve this flavor. I think every brewery has to decide on its own, but I don't think that you definitely don't double the flavor aroma intensity by doubling the amount of hops that you're using for multiple dry hopping.
Right, so you can't just keep on adding and building up. You just need to play with your levels and say, right, you're happy at a certain level.
Yeah.
Okay. And on that theme, has the New England IPA craze come to Germany? And what German hops would you recommend for the style?
Yeah, it has reached Germany. We have very nice New England IPAs from a couple of brewers. There are a lot of varieties that you can use. I think in general you can say, of course, you want the fruity flavors in those types of beer, and then you work with varieties. That would be all the US varieties like Mosaic, Citra, the Australian varieties like Galaxy, Enigma, or Big Secret. The classic European varieties.
Sorry, Christina, we're losing you there a second. Could you just repeat that?
Sorry, I don't know what point I was.
You were just about to get onto European varieties.
Yeah, the European varieties and the new German varieties like Calista, Ariana, also Mandarina Bavaria, Hüllmelon. I think it would also be a good idea to work with enriched pallets, so that you don't take the original type 90 pallets, but a lot of varieties are available as enriched pallets, and then you have a higher oil percentage, you have less polyphenols and less of the material that basically may detriment the fruity flavors that come from these varieties. So a lot of varieties you can choose from, and then in terms of products, maybe consider enriched pellets or even hop extracts with high oil content.
Corvinian, would you recommend one particular variety? Do you have a favorite European variety that you use if you were brewing a New England style IPA?
I like Calista, for example, but I would like to mention some tips for brewing New England IPAs. So you can do a double dry hopping, so you can do the dry hopping during the maturation and the second one during the lagering if you want to do a huge amount of hops. And you should avoid a cool crash. So the down cooling should be very slow in order to keep it hazy.
Right, so don't drop it quickly, just take your time.
Just take your time and do not go below 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, so you keep a lot of haziness in the beer.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so we've got another question again. It obviously is relating to this. So can you elaborate more on which beer styles benefit more from the 3 different stages of adding dry hops? So are there certain hops that shine during one stage more than another stage for getting the desired characteristics?
I think this is really hard to answer because, I mean, yeah, by beer style, the beer styles, they, through the last couple of years, they have become so different within categories. It's really tough to make here a recommendation. For example, the Orval beer from Belgium, they do it the very traditional way in lagering, and I think this is really important for their type of beer. And as Corbinian mentioned, for New England IPA, it's a way of keeping the beer hazy and getting in a lot of hops with a lot of flavor. So I wouldn't say there are clear recommendations in regards to beer style, which timing you should choose.
Is it really down to the flavor that the brewer wants to impart into the beers as opposed to the style?
Yeah.
I know an example. This is a light summer ale, and it's famous for its citrus flavor. And they're doing dry hopping just for the couple of hours at the start of the main fermentation with citra, and they have a very nice citrusy flavor. So as Christina mentioned earlier, if you want to have citrusy and floral notes, some early additions during main fermentation could support those flavors. And the more green and resinous flavors, you should add the hops later on. So during lagering, for example, to keep those terpenes in the beer that are so volatile and not that good soluble.
Mm. And you mentioned, Christina, you mentioned in your presentation that the early pick hops and the late pick hops have different flavors coming through in the hops. Do the brewers have any control over which hops they get? Can they specify that they'd want the early pick for a particular reason or a late pick for a particular reason? Or are all the hops all just harvested at the same time?
No, that's it's not easy to have an influence on the harvest time of the hops, but it depends if you are, for example, Boston Beer, who's into Hallertau Mittelfrüh for many years, and also in close connection with the growers here in the Hallertau. They did a study with the growers and wanted that the Mittelfrüh to be picked later, and invested in talking to the growers how this can be facilitated, because of course each hop grower has different varieties, and for each variety they have a time frame of maybe 1 or 2 weeks where they have to harvest it, so that the frame of playing around is not very high, especially not in the Hallertau. In the US it's different. You have maybe not so many different varieties, but you have huge hop gardens. So through us, through John A. Haas, through Barth Haas, if the brewers are interested in receiving hops picked at a certain time, we can definitely help to try to make this happen. So, and establish the contact with the brewers to do that.
Yeah, that would need to be something that they come to you directly and see if you can work out something with them. Yeah. Okay. And in your experience, is there a difference between using T90 and T45 or cryo hops in dry hopping, considering flavors and aromas?
Yes.
simple answer there. All right, what do you recommend for dry hops, for dry hopping?
It depends on what you're looking for. With the enriched pellets, you always have a higher concentration of oil components, and you definitely have a different flavor. So if you have one variety and you work with T90 pellets, and then you say, I want to make the same beer, but I want enriched pellets to use for this beer, it's not a one-to-one switch that can be easily done, because basically an enriched pellet is a new variety, so to say. It gives you a different flavor profile. So you have to do your trials in the brewery with enriched pellets of a certain variety and to see what it brings to you. But you have a lot of flavors or flavor possibilities working with enriched pellets. not all of the varieties are available as enriched pellets, so you have to ask your supplier if you're looking for a certain variety as in an enriched pellet type. But I think in terms of hop aroma, hop flavor, intensity, it brings benefits to work with enriched pellets in many cases.
Yeah. Corbin, do you have anything to add on that?
Apart from the flavor, when you use enriched pellets, you can reduce the beer losses, for example. You have less vegetative material, and therefore you have less losses. So this is an advantage of the enriched pellets. And also you impart less polyphenols, for example. So, and I think it's easier to work with enriched pellets as you have less material to dose and to work with.
That's a good point. Yeah, the beer losses are reduced.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, Corbin, do you want to tackle this one? So, does oxidation of beta acids contribute to astringency in a beer over time?
No. Good question.
Did you dodge one there, Christina?
If you don't mind, I
Yeah.
would pass the question to Christina. She's more into the bitter compounds.
No
Yeah, I mean, oxidized beta acids, I think there is some work from Schiebele or Hoffmann on our side, also Tom Schellhammer, and they are definitely bitter, and depending on, but the amounts are really small, and then the thresholds are relatively high. So I think to some extent they add to bitterness, but I don't think there is a study that tells you much about the quality of the bitterness.
Well, so nothing definitive has been researched on this.
It's more about the humulinones, the oxidized alpha acids. We know that they are roughly 0.6 times the bitterness of isoalpha acids, and the oxidized beta acids, the holopones. I did a study during my studies in Weinstefan where I tried to produce holopones. That wasn't easy actually, and then in conclusion, in relation to the amount of humulinones and the amount of isoalpha acids, they don't play a big role.
That I think that kind of covers another question, which is, are there any quantitative studies into the bitterness that humulinones can bring into dry hopping? So excuse my pronunciation there. Are there any quantitative studies into their bitterness they can bring into dry hopping? Is there anything that the brewers can access?
Yeah, there's some work from Schellhammer. One of our former colleagues, Victor Al-Ghazali, he did a lot of, and Christina Hahn, they did a lot of research on humulinones, establishing the factor for bitterness. Also, the method to analyze humulinones is available through ASBC. So there's material that where you can make your calculation how much bitterness, if you're dry hopping a beer, how much bitterness probably comes from humulinones. And I can send you the links or the papers.
Okay, that'd be great. If you send to me, I can forward to the brewer who asked for them. So, okay, that's a question that was sent to us earlier. Do you recommend recirculating hops for all dry hopped beers or only heavily dry hopped beers? So is there any downside to recirculating?
And recirculating in terms of basically pumping through an equipment like the hop gun in circles through the...
I'm not sure if he's referring to that or whether it's recirculating back through into the fermenter again. So just keeping the beer moving through the fermenter during dry hopping.
Yeah, I think in terms of extraction velocity and depending on the temperature profile and everything, it's a very efficient way of extracting the hop flavors if you do recirculation. In terms of timing, it's not easy to say, probably a couple of hours, 4 to 6 hours already giving you the big part of the extraction of the flavors. Roughly, I would say.
Okay. We have a couple of questions on future technologies or the things that you're seeing, whether it's new techniques or new technology. I'll probably combine a couple of questions here. One is, what trends do you see for the future of dry hopping? Do you think the market is going towards increasingly more dry hop beers, or will there be a movement towards lighter styles? And there's also another question saying, can you discuss with us the newer technologies happening for hops? So I guess it's one of them is to do with the style variations. One of them is to do with, are there new PHA products? Are there pellet solutions coming through? What are you seeing happening over the next?
Yeah, I think one trend is going also a little bit back towards lagers and Pilsner type beers that are more sessionable, if you want to say it like this, that could still be dry hopped, but in maybe not such an intensive way. For the other dry hopped craft beers like pale ales and IPAs and New England IPAs, I think it's all about, a lot is about drinkability, not too high alcohol content, so lower alcohol content with an intensive hop aroma and a good drinkability. I think these are the product development initiatives that we see with our customers. It's also non-alcoholic beers with intensive hop aroma. I think that is a trend that also will go into the craft market. And in terms of technologies, of course, we are working. Dry hopping is a mess in some way or the other, and but it's also fun for the brewer to work with the material. But we are working on extracts that contain or that you need for dry hopping that are natural, derived from hop pellets, and that are more dry hop friendly, so that they go into solution really easily, that they bring you the maximum flavor or the same amount of flavor, that they decrease your beer losses so that your processes are getting easier. And we think that this topic of efficiency, utilization in terms of oil components, utilization in terms of decreased beer losses, this is becoming more important as the breweries are growing from small to medium and medium to large.
So you see that's areas where you can help them with their cost savings and their efficiencies in the breweries as the market grows and the breweries grow.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I guess that comes in how to maximize. We got another question: how to maximize the utilization of dry hopping to extract more fruity aromas. What stage do you advise for dry hopping to retain much of the aroma? So which is the best stage, would you say, for aroma to maintain your aroma?
I think in our pilot brewery, we mostly work with in the maturation stage with dry hopping. We think this is the best of both worlds. We also we mostly do one dry hopping procedure, so not double or 3 times dry hopping. So if you do one dry hopping, I think this is a good timing to do it. The challenge in giving numbers to utilization in terms of dry hopping is that we still cannot really say, with bitterness, we have the isoalpha acids and the humulinols, we can analyze them with HPLC, we have numbers, and we can see we get higher bitterness if we do this and lower if we do that. With oil and aroma components, it's not so easy. Even if we see high amounts of linalool or myrcene for that matter, still the profile can be really, or the intensity, aroma intensity can still be really low for citrus or fruity or floral aromas. So there are no numbers that we can pick out from the process and watch our utilization, though this has been done by sensory evaluation only.
And if the brewer was wanting to get the best hazy effect from his hops, or at what stage would it be best for them to do their dry hopping?
So for a stable haze or for
Yeah.
a continuous haze?
A stable haze for the beer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe the Corbinian is the better one to answer, but like he said earlier, that you try to avoid the cool crush or the time points where you normally would seek clarification in your process. That will help you with haze development, but it's always a pretty delicate combination in terms of stable haze, that with temperatures and the components involved, proteins, polyphenols, that you really have a stable haze. So I don't know, Corbinian, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I think that's all to say about it. No cool, avoid the cool crash, and yeah. But I want to mention another aspect when we're talking about hop oil amount and flavor. Not only the total amount is important, but the composition of the oil in the beer. And if you compare maturation and lagering, results showed that the total amount of oil is 30% higher if you add the hops during the lagering compared to maturation. But the effect on the flavor is not 30% higher. So it's always about the composition. And it depends on the kind of flavor you want to have in your beer. And this is, I think, the more important aspect if you compare both timings.
Okay. Okay, so another question we have on IBUs. So we experience increased IBU from dry hopping. So my understanding is 90% of the alpha acids, which contribute to IBU, comes out during the first 5 to 10 minutes in the kettle. In terms of percentages, approximately what percentage of alpha acids comes out during dry hopping at the end of fermentation?
Yeah, with IBU, the problem is that this is not a specific measurement. So with the IBU method, you measure basically everything that interferes with the wavelengths of 275 nanometers. Those can be bitter components like the iso-alpha acids, but this can also be non-bitter components like the alpha acids. They only add to bitterness at concentrations that you normally don't get with dry hopping. So the IBU method is not suitable to measure bitterness in dry hop beers. I think through the ASPC, there's the initiative to find IBU method where also the humulinones also can be somehow included, but I'm not up to date how this is going. But yeah, measuring IBUs is like it's a little bit like measuring ballpark figures in dry hop beers.
If you're measuring the alpha acids, the amount of alpha acid that comes out during dry hopping, what kind of percentage alpha acid release do you get?
Percentage is hard to say. What we have measured, you find in craft beers alpha acid amounts up to 30 milligrams per liter. But they influence the bitterness measurements, so they are reflected in the IBU measurement, but in terms of sensory bitterness, they are not contributing.
Right. Okay. So what else we have? As it is evidence that dry hopping works better at warmer temperatures. Oh, sorry. I think we've got a time delay. Christina, are you still there?
Yeah, okay. But I didn't hear the question.
Okay.
Sorry.
As it is evident that dry hopping works better at warmer temperatures, coming to lagers, what would you recommend dry hopping temperature during diacetyl rest to ensure, coming to lagers, would you recommend dry hopping during diacetyl rest to ensure more hop character?
maybe Corbinian and you,
So,
I didn't really get everything. There was
so the typical range, temperature range is between 8 and 12 degrees Celsius, I would say. And those temperatures are suitable for the dry hopping, and you will have a higher yield, a higher utilization compared to 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. So, yeah, 10 degrees Celsius. Yeah.
So you get better utilization, and also you would have avoided the cold crash as well by putting the hops in at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Does head pressure have any impact between dry hopping during main fermentation, maturation, or lagering stages? So, Corbinian, do you want to?
So the head pressure, the higher the head pressure is, the lower the volatility of flavorings is. So maybe you have lower losses of some flavorings, but I think the effect that's more important is that the yeast, the fermentation activity might be a little bit decreased, and the yeast is a very important factor for the production of carbon dioxide, of course, and for the losses of flavorings. So if the fermentation activity is lowered, I think you will have lower losses of some compounds of the hop oil.
So it could have a positive effect.
Yeah, I think so. And so we call it like a burning fermentation, when you have a lot of bubbles and a thick foam layer, and a lot of flavorings can be evaporated during this step. And if you decrease the fermentation activity and if you take more time for it, I think you have more flavor. You keep more flavor in the beer.
Right. Okay. Then we've got a couple of questions on hop creep. So can you explain just a little bit more, Christina, if your sound's okay? We'll let you know if your sound's not so good, and then we'll pop back down to Corbinian. Could you just let us know a little bit more about hop creep, and how can you minimize it? And do different hops have different effects on hop creep?
Yeah, the hop creep, by definition, is basically an over attenuation due to enzymes that we have in hops. Those enzymes have been identified also by the team of Tom Shellhammer, the different enzymes that are active and that lead to this over attenuation. And interestingly, although there's so much dry hopping going on, this phenomenon seriously investigated is only for 3 or 4 years now. It was already reported 100 to 150 years ago in old English books. The phenomenon of the hop creep, I also don't know where hop creep as a term comes from. But it's important because of legislation. If you have a changed alcohol content in your final product, it's important in terms of hazard if the CO2 pressure is still increasing. Minimizing, I think, as soon as you have the combination of yeast and hops, you have the danger of the hop creep. If it's only hops in the lagering time, I think there's no big danger for the hop creep. So it's really when active yeast is also present together with hops. Yeah, Corbinian.
Yeah. A tip would be to do the hopping during the maturation. So if you have more fermentation activity due to the enzymes from the hops, they will take place under control during the maturation, and they will not take place in the bottle, so after the bottling. So if you add the hops during maturation, all fermentation activities or additional fermentation activities are already done, and you will have no hazards by later fermentation activities.
Again, the maturation period seems to be kind of the best time to get all your activity, all your hopping, obviously with the yeast as well, to get all that all done then before the cold crash and the lagering.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. So for dry hopping during maturation, do brewers need to purge with CO2 to remove oxygen?
Yes, I mean, and during maturation.
Yeah, so if they're dry hopping during maturation, do they need to purge with CO2 to remove oxygen?
Depends on your individual configuration, but I think in that you would already be free of oxygen if it's, because I assume that even if you would transfer the beer, that all the vessels would be under CO2 atmosphere.
Right. Okay. Corbin.
So in our concept brewery, the brewers always do or sometimes do the hop addition. So when they transfer the green beer to separate the yeast into a second vessel, they porch the vessel at the hops, porch the vessel, and then they fill it with the beer. And so this is a good timing when they have to transfer the green beer.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we've got time for a couple more questions. So if you can, anyone adding questions now, could you hold on to your questions? If you do have any specific questions you'd like to ask, you can email us directly, and then we can pass them on to Christina and Corbinian for you. So we'll just try and get through the questions that we have now in the Q&A tab. So we've got a question about German versus USA varietals. So many brewers say that aroma intensity of German hops is lower than the US varieties. How could people, if people are using the German hops and the European hops, how can they maximize the aroma of those hops when they're dry hopping?
Yeah, I mean, the difference between German or European varieties and US varieties is often that the US varieties, you have a pretty high oil content compared to European varieties, and also a higher alpha content. So if you would work with enriched type of pallets of the...
Oh, sorry, Christina, we've lost you.
For example, that would...
sorry, Christina, Christina, we just lost you there. Corbinian, can you jump in on this one?
Yeah, I think Christina was talking about enriched pellets. So it's a good idea if you compare the US and the European varieties, if you use enriched pellets from the European varieties, that they have a comparable or equal oil content, that you have the comparable impact due to the dry hopping.
Okay. So if you're dry hopping with them, you're looking for the oil content, and you can use the German varieties, but make sure you got the higher oil content as well. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you avoid the cold crash, will the beer not cold crash later if the beer is stored at 3 degrees? So I'm not sure.
If you avoid the cold crash?
If you avoid the cold crash, will the beer or will it not cold crash later if the beer is stored at 3 degrees?
I transfer this to Corbinian.
That's a good point. I think if you have time, you should store it a long time at 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, and you will have sedimentation of particles. And that's true if you just store it at 5 degrees Celsius for 1 week or less, and you bottle it, then I think you will have the cool crash later on. Yeah, that's true. So you should start a longer period to settle all particles and to avoid the particles at the bottom of a bottle. Yeah.
Right. So take time as opposed to cold crashing quickly. Yeah. Okay. Is there a chance of diacetyl formation in beer when dry hopping is done in lagering stage, when there is not much yeast and the temperature is low? So is there a chance of diacetyl formation in beer when dry hopping is done in the lagering stage, when there is not much yeast and the temperature is low? Christina, let's see if your microphone's working. Let's see if we can hear you.
We didn't have any issues in that respect in our pilot breweries. So
shouldn't be a problem.
Shouldn't be a problem. Yes, but I heard about it. It could be a problem due to the hop creep. So not only the over attenuation, but also production of diacetyl. And you could avoid it if you do it during the maturation.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'll be reactivating whatever yeast is still in there. So that might then lead to some diacetyl.
You won't have a problem.
Yeah. Okay. If I want to make beer with floral or fruity flavor, so adding hops during fermentation is the best time. And making beer with some spice or herb characters is the best time to add it during the lagering stage. So do the different stage pull out different characters, or is it purely down to the hops that you're selecting and the flavors that you're looking to pull out of those hops? Are you more likely to pull out floral flavors during fermentation?
Yeah, it's always a combination of the timing, of the variety, of course, that you're using, and also the temperature that you have at the different stages. So there's nothing. It's not so easy that you can say it's so general. Yeah, but fruity and floral flavors are easier obtained during fermentation. In terms of spicy herbal characters, I think it's the temperature is important. Also, the method is important, and then overall, of course, the variety that you're using and the flavor potential the variety brings is important.
Maybe one aspect more. If you add the hops later on, as we said earlier, you impart massive amounts of terpenes, and they are generally more green and resinous. So you could overlay the floral and citrus notes if you add the hops also at a later stage.
Right.
So
okay.
That would be one aspect. Yeah.
Okay. And then how about non-Saccharomyces microorganisms and dry hopping interactions? Are there problems with that?
You are asking German brewers. Evil subject.
yeah. It's come through as anonymous. Someone's throwing an anonymous question in there.
I think Corbinian is the best to answer.
So hazards if you do dry hopping of a non-Saccharomyces beer type, right?
I'm not entirely sure. I guess so, yes.
Yeah. So it depends on how much sugars I think you have still inside. And it's more an issue of microbiological issues. And so I don't see any other hazards or interactions that would lead to a bad flavor or so on. So it's more about Brettanomyces, for example. They a lot of beers have beautiful flavors through the action of Brettanomyces with hops. So I think they offer also flavor potential if you want to have them in your brewery.
Okay, so last question, and we've got a question that's not on hops. So please, can you give us some key considerations to take into account when dry hopping with fruits and other materials?
Yeah.
Take you off the hops for a second.
First recommendation would be if you're looking for a certain flavor like mango or pineapple, maybe you look for the right hop variety that brings you that flavor. But we talked to our brewers. We also did some experiments in our breweries. It's not our core competence, so probably you get better advices from other sources. But if you can work with puree, and that's what a lot of brewers do, it's relatively easy in handling. And you can just put it at the same timing into the brewing process. If you're working with whole fruits or peels or solid material, You probably also need an equipment and that's, I think, the hop gun or the other equipments. They are also constructed that they can contain or retain other materials for dry hopping. But then, in terms of peels, for example, you have to consider that you don't bring in additional microorganism into your process that you don't want, and also if the material is organic in terms of pesticides, residues, and all that stuff.
So sanitation is very important.
It's the same, yeah.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. Thank you. So we just finished a hop presentation on a non-hopping note. So there we go. There's a bit of a twist for you. Well, I'd like to bring the session to an end now. Thank you very much, Christina, for taking time to talk with us, and also to Corbinian as well. It's a great session. We had some great questions, which has been very good. Thank you very much to all of those who joined in, because it's them taking part and raising the questions that's really make these sessions worthwhile. So next week we're going to be running a panel session. So we're going to go away from the technical next week. We're going to be talking with some brewers and some brewery owners and people in the industry about how they're doing at the moment and how they're surviving this crisis. So I'll finish up with saying thank you very much to our panelists. And thank you very much to all you who've attended, who've taken the time off to come and join us for this webinar. Like we mentioned at the beginning, the webinar has been recorded, so you'll be able to catch it on our website, which is www.c-brew.com. You'll be able to find it on our blog page and our article page. And also Christina is going to share with me her presentation. So if anybody wants a copy of the presentation, please send me a message through the website, and I can send you a copy of that presentation. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you for Corbinian for taking the time. It's been great to be able to chat with you both. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.